What if
most people
misunderstand about empaths is
music and empaths
they assume the shutting you out emotionally.
that somehow
you could understand
has
hidden
few or no
system
friends,
behind it.
it must
they
be because they don't know how to
disappear from your
connect.
life.
But that's
Because
not just
today,
inaccurate, it's
you're going to
backwards.
learn something
Empaths
most
don't
people
lack
never
connection
notice.
skills.
Empaths
In fact,
don't
they often
music
operate
randomly
at a level of
detached.
emotional
They follow a
perception
psychological
that most
sequence
people
that
never
runs
reach.
silently.
They read
Music in
tone,
the background.
micro-expressions,
and once you understand it, you
inconsistencies
stop
between
guessing
words
their
and feelings.
behavior and start
They don't just
decoding
hear
it.
what's said,
Here's
they
the part most
register what's
people
meant,
completely
what's
music
hidden, and
misunderstand.
what's avoided.
Empaths
And
are
that
not
level
slow
of
to
awareness
react.
changes
They are
the
slow to
entire
conclude.
social experience.
There's a difference.
Because once
They
you
operate
see
on
beneath
a
the
perception
surface
versus
consistently,
reaction model,
surface level
while most people
interaction
music
starts to
respond to
feel
what
empty.
just happened.
Small talk isn't just
Empaths
boring
track
to an
what's
empath, it's
consistently
disorienting.
happening beneath
It
the
feels like
surface.
participating in
Metamusic.
something
They don't
artificial,
isolate
like
moments.
everyone
They
agreed to
connect
stay
patterns
on the
across
surface while
time.
pretending
They don't
depth isn't
music just hear
available.
words.
Conversations
They measure
become
alignment.
predictable. They don't just
Reactions
see
feel
actions.
rehearsed.
They
Emotional
evaluate
sincerity.
intention.
And
because
over
of this, they
time, this
delay
creates a
reaction.
quiet but
And not out of
persistent sense
confusion,
disconnect.
but out of precision.
So,
they're
the
collecting
empath faces
data,
a choice whether
emotional
they consciously
consistency,
realize it or
behavioral
not.
patterns,
Do they
music,
keep engaging
energetic
in
shifts.
interactions
They
that
notice
feel
what
shallow
repeats.
and misaligned?
They notice
just
what
to
changes
maintain
music,
social
and more
volume,
importantly,
or
they
do
notice
step
what
back
doesn't
and
match.
wait for something
And during
real?
this time,
Most
music
choose
they
to
may
step
look
back.
calm,
And that's where the
even
misunderstanding
accepting,
begins.
unbothered. From the
Present,
outside, it looks
still
like
engaged,
withdrawal,
but internally,
it looks like isolation.
they're building a
But
psychological
internally,
profile.
it's not driven by
music
fear.
layer by
It's
layer,
driven by
interaction
discernment.
by interaction.
Empaths are
One
not
silent
looking for
question
more
runs in the
conversations.
background.
They're
Music
looking
for
is this a
honest
moment
ones.
or a pattern?
They're not
and once that
interested
question
in
is
being
answered,
surrounded,
everything
they're interested in
accelerates
being
because
understood.
music empaths
And once they
don't
realize
need
how rare that
repetition
is, their
once
standards
clarity is
naturally
reached.
rise.
They don't
This
need
is where the
confirmation
social circle
once the
starts
pattern
to shrink.
stabilizes.
Not because
Their
people
behavior
reject them,
changes
but
music
because
instantly,
quietly
not
opt out of
dramatically, but
interactions
definitively.
that don't
So
meet
what
a
looks like
certain
patience
level
is
of
actually calculated
authenticity.
observation.
They stop
and
forcing
what feels
laughter.
like tolerance
They stop
is
pretending
simply
interest.
delayed detachment.
They stop
in
investing
progress.
energy into
There is a
dynamics
specific
that
moment.
feel one-dimensional.
You won't music
and
see
here's
it.
the part
You won't
most
hear
people
it, but it
miss.
changes everything.
This isn't a loss,
Pattern
it's a
recognition
filtration
process.
process.
Before
the
this
empath
point, the
isn't
empath
becoming
is
less
interpreting.
social.
They're
Becoming
analyzing,
more
adjusting,
precise,
trying to
more
understand the
intentional,
gaps
more
between what's
aligned
said
with
and
what
what's felt.
actually fulfills
After this
them.
point,
Instead
they're no
of what
longer
simply
interpreting.
occupies their time.
They're seeing clearly,
But there's a
directly,
cost
without
to that
distortion.
precision.
This
Depth
is
is
where
rare.
emotional
Genuine
attachment
emotional
loses its
presence is
influence.
rare.
Music,
People
because
who are
once a
comfortable
pattern
being
becomes
seen
predictable,
clearly,
it
and
stops
who can see
feeling
others
personal
clearly in
music
return,
and starts
are
feeling
not
structural,
the
something
majority.
repeatable,
So,
something
when an
fixed,
empath
and
raises their
structure is
threshold
easier
for
to detach
connection,
from,
the
than
number of
emotion.
people who can
Here's
meet
the
them
shift.
there drops
They stop
significantly.
music asking,
and they
why
know
is this
that
happening?
They understand,
and start recognizing,
often without
this is how
putting
it
it into
works.
words.
That single
choosing
realization
depth
collapses
means
confusion.
accepting solitude
It removes
more
the need
often
to keep
than others
analyzing,
do.
to keep
But to
questioning,
them,
to
that
keep
trade-off
music
makes
hoping
sense.
for a different outcome.
Because being
And when
alone
confusion
doesn't feel
disappears,
nearly as
so
heavy as being
music does
surrounded by
emotional
people who
investment
don't
because
truly see you.
uncertainty creates
So they become
attachment.
comfortable
But
in that
clarity
space,
creates
not
distance.
because they don't
Once they
value
see
relationships,
inconsistency
but
as
because they
music,
value real
consistent
ones
effort
too much
as
to settle
conditional,
for anything
presence
less.
as unstable.
And when you
Their
understand
brain
that,
categorizes
everything
the
changes.
connection as
The narrative
non-viable,
shifts from
not temporarily
why don't they have
flawed,
more
but
friends
fundamentally
to a much more
misaligned.
accurate question.
And once something is
how many
labeled that
people are
way,
actually
the
capable
system
of
protects
meeting
itself,
them
not
at the level
emotionally
they
but
live
automatically.
Because when
That's the
someone is
cutoff.
wired for
And once
depth,
crossed,
surface
you're no
level
longer
connection
being
doesn't just
understood.
feel insufficient.
You're being
it feels
phased out.
dishonest.
Empaths,
and most
music
people
don't
would rather
disappear
have company
randomly
than truth.
They don't walk
An
away on
empath
impulse.
would rather
They don't
have
music
truth than company.
detached from
The
single
next
events.
piece of this
They
becomes
respond
even
to
more
specific
practical,
internal
and in many
signals
ways
that
more
build over
misunderstood.
time.
When we
Music
say
quietly
empaths absorb
consistently,
energy, it
and
can
beneath
beneath
the
the
surface
surface
of
of
normal
almost
interaction.
mystical.
But there's a very real
activate
psychological
withdrawal.
mechanism
Music
behind
one,
it.
emotional
Empaths are highly
inconsistency. attuned to
Unstable
emotional
music,
states, not just in a
presence,
cognitive
disrupts
way, but
trust
in a physiological
faster than
one.
conflict
Their
ever
nervous
could,
system
because
responds
it's not the
rapidly to the
disagreement
emotional
music
cues
that
of
creates
others.
distance.
Tone shifts,
It's
tension and
unpredictability.
posture.
When
Subtle
someone's
changes
emotional
in breathing,
state,
these
attention,
aren't just
or engagement
observed,
keeps
they're felt.
shifting.
And when
without
you're around
clarity,
someone
it
who is
forces the
anxious,
empath
frustrated,
into a constant
manipulative,
state
or
of
emotionally
internal
chaotic.
monitoring. Your body
Our music,
begins
and
to
over
mirror
time,
that
that
state,
sustained alertness
whether you
becomes
intend to or
mentally and
not.
emotionally
So
exhausting.
over time,
the nervous
social
system
interaction
starts
prioritizing
neutral.
stability
It becomes
over
costly.
connection.
This is
Two,
where the pattern starts to
unreciprocated depth.
form.
When
An
emotional
empath
investment
spends time
is
in a
mirrored,
group, or
they
even
begin
one-on-one,
reducing
and walks
music feeling drained,
not as
not
a
tired in
decision
the
at
normal
first,
sense,
but
but
as a
depleted,
natural
like
response,
something has been
because
taken
empaths
rather than
don't just
exchanged.
notice imbalance.
At first, they
They
don't
feel
always
it,
understand why.
and when depth
They
is
may assume
consistently
it's just
one-sided,
introversion or
the internal
stress.
system
But as
begins
the pattern
recalibrating,
repeats,
the
the cause
music
becomes
automatically.
clear.
It's not the presence of people that drains them,
selectively
it's the
shared.
quality of
3.
emotional
Energetic
energy
drain.
those people
Music.
carry.
And
When
here's where it gets
interaction
more
consistently
precise.
costs more
Most
than it
people
gives,
regulate
their
their
nervous
internal
system
state
flags the
independently.
connection.
An
Music
empath,
as
on the other hand,
unsustainable.
often
This
regulates
is an
in
emotional
response to
reaction
the environment.
That
It's
means if they're
biological
surrounded by
regulation. The body
unresolved
starts
tension,
signaling that the
they
exchange
feel
is
it.
music.
If they're
no
around
longer balanced
negativity,
enough
they
to maintain.
process it.
Now,
If
here's
someone
the
is
key
masking
insight. These
insecurity
triggers
or
don't
anger,
create sudden
the empath
reactions.
picks up on the mismatch.
They initiate recalibration.
And their system
Music,
works to reconcile
the
it.
empath
That's
starts
effort,
adjusting
constant
quietly.
invisible
Less
effort.
emotional
Now,
exposure.
imagine
less
doing that
availability,
across multiple
less internal
relationships
music
across
prioritization,
days, weeks,
and this
years.
happens without
Eventually,
eventually the empath reaches a point where their internal system starts to push back. Not emotionally, but strategically. Balance. They begin to reduce exposure. Once all three triggers are confirmed, withdrawal becomes they limit conversations, they become more selective about where they did go, who they see. When an empath begins to leave, they don't because they've lost interest in people. There is no sudden break, no visible pattern, no single moment that defines the exit. This is where outsiders often misread the detachment sequence. It looks like with stage 1, avoidance, or even disinterest. This is where the shift begins. But in reality, it's a form of calibration. Depth fades first. The empath is learning to protect their baseline. They stop sharing what matters. Become aware that certain environments, consistently disrupt your internal transparency, continuing to expose yourself. What used to be open becomes measured. Music controlled and selective. An empath, they are still present, but no longer fully music accessible. Stop neglecting themselves. Stage 2, cognitive detachment. They start asking different questions. The mental connection of how do I maintain this relationship? You stop occupying their mental space. What does this interaction cost me? There is no longer overthinking. That shift alone changes analysis of interaction. And here's the critical point. Music, where most people don't even measure relationships this way. They measure based on no longer invest energy into music interpretation because the need to understand starts dissolving. How do I feel during this interaction? Music, how do I feel after it? Stage 3, is there mutual regulation, or am I the one constantly stabilizing the dynamic? Communication becomes consistently one-sided. The empath doesn't argue, they adjust. This is why their circle gets smaller but more stable. They still respond, fewer people, but less chaos, fewer interactions, more clarity. Now here's what they're not trying to maximize social contact. This entire process happens while they are still physically present, and once they experience what it feels like to be around someone who doesn't externally, someone who is grounded, self-aware, broken, emotionally, they are still there, still responding, still visible, but internally access has already been restricted. It raises the standard permanently. And once emotional access is removed, tolerance for draining the connection loses its influence completely. So what looks like distance is actually refined. No confrontation what looks like isolation is actually closure is demanded because the empath isn't retreating from people, they're eliminating the psychological exit has already been completed long ago. When your internal state is constantly influenced by your environment, protecting that they don't just leave a person. The truth is simple. They leave a version of being around someone. This is where most people misunderstand the depth of the shift. Identity shift connection. That's the version that once existed in that connection was built. You start to see a third factor of emotional capacity, and this one is less about wiring and more about over-explained, because it's not just that empaths a version that prioritized understanding over boundaries, that connection over self-preservation and emotional harmony are placed in the wrong environments. Empaths tend to operate with a high degree of tolerance. And this is critical because the separation is not only external, they rationalize internal restructuring. They look for context. Once that shift happens, the mind, for reasons that explain why someone acted the way they did. And in isolation, that's not a weakness. That's advanced social intelligence. But in the real world, once growth music happens, regression feels because when you consistently understand people more than they understand themselves, you also become easier to overlook. They avoid it because it no longer aligns with who they have become flexible. Your patience, the clarity they reach cannot be undone. And your willingness the patterns they saw cannot even when something feels off. And once perception changes at that level, emotional memory no longer dictates behavior the same way. So the empath gives more. So even music, if the situation reappears, even if familiarity returns, they carry emotional weight that was never assigned to them, but they pick it up anyway because has already shifted permanently. And for a while it works. And perception controls the relationship continues. This is why the connection appears stable. Not because they are holding on to emotion, but because they have moved beyond the version of reality where the other is consuming it. Now, here's where it shifts because eventually repetition creates clarity. The empath starts to becomes a question of identity, isolated incidents, but that is where the return ends. They begin to see that certain people only show up when they need something. That apologies don't lead to disconnect. That their understanding because what looks like loss from the outside is actually internal redistribution. And this is a critical moment because at this point the empath has enough data to make a different decision. While they are emotionally invested, whether their attention is constantly music outward. They stay longer on understanding others, hoping that maintaining balance will lead to transformation and sustaining connection. But over time, even that hope starts to erode. Their awareness is directed music cynical emotional states of others. Accurate, subtle shifts. They realize that understanding someone doesn't obligate you to tolerate them. But the moment that distinction becomes clear, behavior changes quickly. Music. Their attention returns inward, and that shift changes. They stop justifying other people's actions because control only exists. They stop trying to manage outcomes that were never theirs to control. Once that access is removed, and most importantly, they stop giving at a level that isn't no more emotional. This is often where people around them become confused because the empath, who was once always available, seeking validation, always accommodating explanations for clarity, but what looks like a personality behavior pattern is actually a boundary correction. And in that state, they haven't become colder, not emotionally cold, more precise, not detached. They're no longer responding automatically. But internally complete, selectively, that is self-regulated, and that shift alone disrupts every dynamic that was built on their previous overextension. Some relationships fall apart at this stage, not because it is not a reaction to pain, but because it is the result of resolution, not chaos, not it was sustained by their willingness to carry more than their share. Fully settled. And once that willingness is removed, reaches that point, they don't argue. This is why their circle often shrinks so dramatically, because when you stop overgiving, they simply exit the dynamic compatible with people who are benefiting from it. And then externally, there are more of those people than most realize. No closure required. But here's the part that matters. They quietly disappear forever. This isn't lost. What if you could recognize the exact exposure? It reveals which connections you out emotionally and which were, and you can understand the hidden system behind it. That clarity is completely disappear from your life. Because once you have experienced what it feels like to learn something most people never notice, or emotionally depleted, randomly detach. They follow a psychological sequence that runs silently. Music in the background. You integrate it, and once you understand, become harder to manipulate, harder to access without intention, and far more aware of where your energy is going and why. So when you see an empath with very few people, they are slow to conclude. Understand that you're not looking at someone who failed to build versus reaction model. You're looking at someone who learned through respond to what just happened. Which relationships were never real to begin happening beneath the conclusion they arrive at is simple. They don't isolate moments. Empathy without boundaries patterns across time. It's self-abandonment. Music just hear words. If you take everything they measure alignment, depth over surface, they don't just see sensitivity to energy. They evaluate lessons learned through being overextended. It all leads to a final shift, not out of confusion, but out of precision. And this is where the empath collecting fundamentally separates from the majority. Behavioral patterns. At some point, they stop asking, "How do I maintain connection?" They notice what changes music. What kind of life actually feels right to live? And during this question changes the entire framework, because even most social behavior is driven by an unconscious, still engaged, but internally people stay in conversations they don't enjoy, relationships layer by layer, interaction by interaction, that exhaust them. One silent question runs in the sense of belonging. Music. There's a trade moment or a pattern, authenticity, and once that question is answered, everything becomes aware of because music and more importantly, they start to reject once clarity not in a dramatic or they don't need confirmation, but in a quiet, deliberate recalibration. Their behavior changes to notice that every time they ignore their internal signals. So every time they tolerate noise is actually calculated superficiality, and what feels like tolerance is simply delayed detachment. And over time, that cost becomes a specific moment. You won't make a decision you won't most people avoid for as long as possible. Pattern recognition. They choose internal alignment. Before this point, the empath is interpreting, and that's where they're analyzing, adjusting, trying to understand. They spend more time alone, but it doesn't feel like deprivation. After this point, it feels no longer interpreting without constant external clearly, directly, without distortion. Their emotions. This is where emotional attachment loses its influence. They're no longer adjusting themselves. Once a pattern becomes, they're allowing the environment to reveal whether personal music and starts feeling structural, something repeatable. And once that happens, the need to be liked and structure is easier to detach from than emotion. Not because they've become indifferent, but because they've experienced something more valuable than approval, and start recognizing this is how it works. That who they are internally, that single realization collapses conflict with how they're living. It removes the need to keep analyzing, a level of psychological consistency most people rarely reach. And when confusion disappears, this can be does emotional investment. People may assume the empath has become distant, but clarity creates even arrogant. Once those interpretations usually come from individuals who are still operating within the approval-based framework. Their brain to them choosing peace over participation non-viable, not temporarily flawed. It's not even fundamentally misaligned because they have already. And once something is labeled that way, they've been in the crowded rooms, the constant conversations, the relationships maintained out of habit, and once crossed, you're no longer being understood. They've seen the result. You're more noise, more confusion, empaths, music don't disappear randomly. So they don't walk away on impulse. They reduce unnecessary interaction. They become highly selective. They respond to specific internal signals, not out of fear, but out of respect quietly for their own mental and beneath the surface of normal interaction. They prioritize environments that feel triggers activate grounded and genuine. Music one, emotional and doing so, something interesting happens. Music presence their relationships trust while fewer faster become significantly more stable because it's not there's less performance, less misunderstanding, less emotional volatility. Predictability. The connections they do someone's emotional based state, on mutual awareness or engagement keeps shifting without space clarity. For silence forces the empath into a constant state of internal monitoring. That's the standard now. Music and over time, that standard is set. There's no mentally and emotionally exhausting because the nervous system starts prioritizing stability over avoiding. Two, being surrounded by the wrong people when emotional investment isn't mirrored, far more damaging form of discomfort than being alone. Not one as obvious and temporary, the other is natural and cumulative because empaths so they choose carefully, not perfectly, but consciously. They feel it, And that's
when
the
depth is
distinction.
consistently
Their life is no longer
one-sided,
built
the
around
internal
reacting
system
to what's
begins
available. It's
recalibrating
built around
music
responding to
automatically.
what's aligned.
What was once
Every
freely given
interaction,
becomes
every
selectively
relationship,
shared.
every environment
energetic
is
drain.
filtered through a
Music.
simple question.
Does this
When interaction
contribute to my
consistently
peace,
costs
or does
more
it
than
disrupt
it gives,
it?
the nervous
If it
system
disrupts
flags
it,
the
it doesn't
connection.
stay.
Music as
And that's why their
unsustainable.
circle looks the
This
way
is
it
an
does.
emotional reaction.
It's not empty,
It's
it's
music.
refined.
It's
because
biological
in
regulation.
The end, the empath
The body
isn't
starts
searching for
signaling
more
that the
people.
exchange is
They're
music,
protecting
no longer
something far
balanced
more
enough to
valuable than
maintain.
that. They're protecting
Now here's
their
the
state
key
of
insight.
mind.
These
And
triggers
once you
don't
understand
create
the
sudden
value of
reactions.
that,
You
they
stop
initiate
chasing connection
recalibration
and start
music.
choosing it.
The